So this is my commentary, my reflection, my observations on the book of Proverbs. This episode marks the beginning of chapter 26. As snow in summer, and as rain in harvest, so honor is not seemly for a fool. Now this is a verse that we've seen before, at least in part. I believe it was in the last chapter, chapter 25. In fact, it was chapter 25, verse 13. And although the meaning of the verse is not the same, it shares some interesting symbolism, specifically that of the harvest. So we have two comparisons here. We have snow in summer and rain in harvest. To the example of honor not being for a fool. So I want to talk a little bit about perhaps the obvious, about the first part of the verse. Maybe a little bit more about what an improbability or a contradiction may present, how it may unfold in our lives, and perhaps my own personal experiences. And then get into a broader discussion about honor and about the foolish person. So beginning with snow in summer. Now I happen to live in the Midwest, and seeing snow in summer is quite uncommon. If I were to see snow in summer, I would certainly notice it. I would think it to be out of place. Now I said contradiction earlier. Maybe that's not the right word to use, but it's certainly contra traditional way of things, that we do not expect that snow to come, that it is a relative improbability that in the month of August that we are in at the moment, that it would snow, but even less so in July. Now, I think there's a number of ways that we can see this, that we can interpret this. Certainly uncommon events happen, and when they do happen, they garner our attention. The unfamiliarity of these events surprises us. It captivates us. But at the same time, it's possible to use this expression to say that the usefulness, at least in the second situation, as rain and harvest, the usefulness of that rain and harvest is not very great, because we are already harvesting the crop. If it had come during the seasons when the crop was growing and it required a lot of water, then we would be thankful for that. We'd imagine that to be more appropriate. But when a lot of rain comes in harvest, it's too late for what was needed to take effect. And at the outset, I had thought that these two comparisons, or the two analogies, were quite similar in the fact that they would be uncommon. But I don't necessarily think that rain during harvest is uncommon. I think about the season that we harvest corn here in the United States, in the Midwest. We see the harvest come during the fall. And it is not uncommon to have rain during the fall. Perhaps it may be less so than during spring. But if I experienced a rainy day during the harvest season, I wouldn't think it out of the ordinary. I'm more inclined to think that a heavy period of rain during the harvest season would be more unfortunate, in the sense that I've already mentioned, that we could have used that water when the crop was growing. And so the word that comes to mind here is redundant. That it is more than necessary. I suppose there's another word that we can use, in the sense that what is needed at one time that has now come to pass, because that time has passed, we no longer are able to utilize that thing that was needed. Whatever the word for that is, it's a lack of the vital component, the lack of the principled component at the appropriately placed time. So honor is not seemingly for a fool. Now, keeping in mind that we have the word redundant and the word improbable or unlikely floating in our heads. So we can say that for a fool to have honor, this is a redundant statement, and we can say that this is unlikely to occur or improbable. Now, in the comparisons or in the analogies, what we are dealing with here is the natural course of the environment. That it is just the way of things that causes us to be. And that it is not necessarily dependent on any one of us. It wouldn't change just because we experience a rain that is during harvest. It doesn't change the way that we plant our seed. Maybe given long enough, we may make some adjustments, but the productive season is the productive season, and we can't push too far into the fall or into winter, otherwise the crop will die, and the harvest will be poor. And so much like the natural sway of things, the natural observation of nature, the natural observation of the fool yields similar results. But the thing that we are not necessarily told or suggested is how it is the case that a fool cannot have honor. Now, in order to explore this territory, I think we have to start with defining what honor is. So a Google definition of the term, it means high respect or great esteem. The second definition, adherence to what is right or to a conventional standard of conduct. As a verb, we have regard with great respect, we have to fulfill an obligation or to keep an agreement. The third definition of the word honor as a noun, something regarded as a rare opportunity and bringing pride and pleasure, a privilege. So of all of these definitions, we have the image that is unfolding of the participation of the heart in this experience in one way or another. There's a mention of pride and of satisfaction. I'm not a big fan of that word, pride, but let's say satisfaction or some pleasure that is experienced, this privilege. There is this idea of willfully attending or adhering to something that is correct or that is right, which implies some process that's underneath there to determine exactly what is right. And this high respect and great esteem, I think this is the most difficult to understand. Because within the word respect, we have, again, this reference back to the heart. That respect is something of a feeling of deep admiration. And this feeling of deep admiration is elicited by their abilities, by their qualities or their achievements. Now, another interesting definition of the word respect is a particular aspect, a point, or a detail, which may seem completely unrelated. We can have a word that has multiple different meanings, but it would seem that if we are to take the word and all of its meaning and apply it to this situation, that I think we should both take the idea of this, again, the heartfelt participation, feeling of deep admiration for an ability, quality, or achievement. And we should take that idea of the pointedness, the detail, or a particular aspect of something that calls our attention, that we are focusing on something. Now, what's more of this pointed pleasure, it is not just arbitrary, for I think that the arbitrary pleasure of man is that of the fool's domain. But somebody that is honored or has honor, their pleasures are directed highly. I think of esteem. And I think of the word respect. I think of somebody that thinks of somebody else or admires somebody else highly. And this word highly is the key, because it is highly relative to something else. It's highly in the sense that there is good reason for them to be above either another person, an institution, a set of qualities, characteristics, whatever it might be. Now, today happens to be a new day. And I know that I had not really recorded much prior to the day elapsing and beginning anew. But it's funny how the mind works. It's funny how our feelings drive the way that we behave and the way that we produce, the way that we are faithful to a particular task, idea, whatever. And yesterday was a day that I think a degree of discipline had failed me. I'm thankful that I had sat down and explored this first verse. And I'm thankful to have opened up a degree of it, such that I can continue with it today. But during the process of recording that, I had felt weak, like my mind was tired, and it had a very difficult time thinking of the next thing to say, or to the next logical piece to move to jump to. And what I find fascinating is that aspect of my experience, how exhaustion can creep in, whether it be from the workday or from a workout, whatever it might be. And yet, if we are to always give in to that weakness, to the thing that tempts us away to accept that the fatigue has won, rather than to fulfill our obligations, then our obligations never become fulfilled. And I think that there's something about that experience that is all too common to me, and I'm sure that it's common to many people. And it may come to us in varying degrees. Tomorrow I may feel right back where I was yesterday. I may feel better than I do today. It's difficult to say sometimes, even if we try our best to control for it. But honor is something that is not necessarily dependent on the way that we feel. It is a standard that is there to be had. And it is up to us to accept whether or not we are going to maintain a certain standard, to modify it, or to fall and to fail to rise up to that height. And I think that there is a lot of nuance there. There's a lot of nuance in the sense that we all begin from different places. We all put forth a different amount of effort. And a lot of that, I think, is dependent upon the way that the mind wishes to proceed and what it can tolerate. But in my experience, if it's not pushed, if the discipline is weak, then honor will not come, obligations will not be met. I think of verse 27 of chapter 25. It is not good to eat much honey, so for men to search their own glory is not glory. And although it's not necessarily the case that I wish to say that I'm looking for honor, it is more so the case that I wish not to indulge in that aspect of mind that accepts the fatigue, because there is always a way to push towards something that will sustain us. It's an aspect of faith, I believe. Of course, the mind always needs a rest. But given our faithful practices, we should not be so quick to fall into the ease of mind. And so this brings me back to level and distinction. I think often in the Proverbs what we are exposed to is an open canvas for which we can explore and we can paint our own scenery. What we are given is a prompt, but it's up to us to really bring it to life. And so what sticks out to me now is this idea of level. What sticks out to me also is, again, that pointedness of attention. And given that within the Proverbs we are subtly pushed in particular directions, sometimes like the proverb that we have in front of us, we are given quite a broad set of constraints. Constraints in the sense that honor has some meaningful distinction and the fool has some meaningful distinction. But between those two, and the ways in which one can fall into foolishness, there are many, just as there are many paths towards high regard, honor. And what my mind longs for, coming off of what I had just said about the ease of mind, is to have something like the Ten Commandments, just to tell me what to do, so I can just behave and fall in line and have good things come to me. But of course, life is nowhere near this simple. In fact, it is just the opposite. It requires a strong agent to be able to be satisfied in life and to get to a place that is satisfying in life. It's difficult to think that life could be anything other than pain if that's all we are used to. Or I think even more troubling, if we are not in pain, it's something that I think we can surely choose to see, and that many of us may live quite sufficient lives in terms of the survival sense, but we may be dissatisfied with the choices that we've made and the effort that we put in, and that brings us to view things in a particular way, to view things negatively. And that orientation of attention will tempt us down the road towards that foolishness, towards the absence of mind, towards the improbable. If we have a problem that confronts us, I know all too well in my experience, especially in my younger days, in which I would imagine all of the possible solutions, and I would fixate on some of the worst case scenarios. The worst case scenarios are often improbable and often avoidable, given enough foresight and consideration. But of course, foresight, and in my situation, foresight, my memory of these situations, my foresight was overshadowed by my worry about the worst case scenario. And that I had built up this narrative in my mind that the worst case scenario would never really be this thing that could be overcome. And I would imagine that, given some thought, even the worst case scenario would have some path, road to liberation. So what I'm saying here, going along with this pointedness, the importance of attention, that our agency, that our ability to choose the different paths that are before us is quite large. It is vast, even if we feel as though we are being constricted by a set of physical constraints or mental constraints, whatever it might be. And what causes us to change position or change level, I think, is attending to those things that allow us to solve problems effectively. I was talking to somebody today about potential solutions to technological limitations that we face in the workplace. This person happened to work for a telecom company, heavily involved in infrastructure. And it became quite clear that when the linguistic parameters are set up in such a way that affords a productive conversation, then a lot of work can be done. A lot of productive work can be done. And that's rather simple, I think, and self-explanatory, but the practice and the exercise of exploring it is quite satisfying. And again, I think it's quite productive. It moves the ball forward. But much like this idea of level, of height, and of moving forward, it's very difficult to define. And it would seem that there are many thoughts that are flashing through my mind at the moment. It seems that there are so many different levels in which we can be tempted away from some center point of attention and move down some other path to be distracted or to pursue something that is potentially productive, and then we get diverted further and go somewhere else. And I think this entire experience of this happening, if assuming that it's not rounded off and that these paths don't actually lead somewhere, that one can identify that this pursuit, this exercise of behavior and of will, has actually made me a better person, or has made the people around me better people, or better off because of what I have done, or what I've participated in. And this is the sort of thing that I think leads to honor. In the sense that if we can say of somebody that is honorable, that they are distinguished, that they are distinct, that they are readily recognizable among the vastness of mediocrity that is out there. Or it doesn't necessarily have to be within that domain or that plane. It could be any number of things by which we can identify a person, and I think I'm using a person here because we're talking about honor, obviously, but my mind thinks about the more basic distinction about that which is identifiable and what makes things different. But within the context of honor, there's such a beautiful and rich elevation of possibility here. Instead of talking about objects that we can identify differences and distinctions based on their characteristics, now we have the domain of what is right and what is wrong, of behavior, of action, of attending to things that make a difference, of attending to things that bring people together, or, obviously, someone that is distinct can be someone that does the complete opposite. And I think there are plenty of people that have been given honor by the others of society because they are distinct and they are different. They have a loud voice, but it is the loud voice that perhaps I should say that it's the distinction that some people actually value most highly, and it's not necessarily just the distinction. Distinction's important, but it's distinction plus goodness. That distinction plus goodness brings true honor, instead of this false attribution, which ultimately ends in the abuse of position and of authority. So honor is not seemingly for a fool. Now, if I have not demonstrated what foolishness is, at least at some point in this podcast, I'd be quite surprised, because I'm flirting with it quite heavily here. I'm trying to organize my thoughts and my attention in such a way that it is pointed and that it is directed, that I'm moving towards something in particular. And to do that, I recognize that I have to take particular experiences, and that the philosophical domain, or maybe the illustrative domain, can only get me so far. The fool, or the foolishness, creeps in when the mind gets lost in the snow and summer situation. When it considers things that can no longer have an impact on its thought process. Things that are done in the past. They cannot be undone. As the rain and harvest. As the bird wandering, as the swallow by flying, so the curse causeless shall not come. So this is an interesting verse. A verse that relies on analogy, a pattern that we see often. As the bird by wandering, I think immediately that a bird wanders often. But yet again, in another way, a bird is, I don't want to say controlled, I don't necessarily want to say dictated, because they are agents to a degree, not in the same way that we have agents, that we are agents, that we have agency. but they are preoccupied by their instincts. Much, I suppose, we can say that we are as well, that birds are concerned about satisfying their hunger, about more generally satisfying their needs, of reproducing. And there is a rather mundane distinction, I think, to be made here. Maybe it's mundane, maybe it's not, but this wandering behavior, I wonder about it. As the definition on Google says, walk or move in a leisurely, casual, or aimless way. To stroll, to saunter, to roam, to dawdle, to ramble, to putter. All of these sorts of things, for the most part, I would imagine that a bird doesn't do. I would imagine that they're continually engaged in behaviors that are geared towards their reproduction, satisfying their needs. But all the same, as I've mentioned, I think that the birds are agents, not entirely robotic. Their programs offer them a degree of agency, and I think that what this agency affords is a type of play, a type of leisure, in the way that we may be able to observe such behavior that doesn't immediately relate to procuring a mate, or finding food, or calling out into the environment for, again, a mate, or providing for their young. I think there are situations that I have observed in which birds have engaged in play, participated in something that seemed to either bind birds together in some relationship. In that manner, I suppose one could make the extended argument that by engaging in such behavior, they are furthering their productive capacities by some interrelated web of that relationship that they're building with another species, bird of the same species, of the opposite sex, whatever. But I don't necessarily think that's a productive way to think about it. But rather, I choose to believe that birds have the ability to engage in this leisurely activity, to saunter, to stroll, and again to play, and play in the sense that they are concerned with whatever it means to engage in that behavior that doesn't directly relate as far as their own, if we can attribute will and agency, which I think we can, to them, it doesn't directly relate to that. Again, if one chooses to analyze it completely in terms of their selective breeding practices, I think a lot will be missed. As the bird by wandering, the bird wanders. The bird has the capacity to wander. As the swallow by flying, this is more clear-cut, I think. A swallow being a type of bird. I'm not sure at the significance of the swallow, though, if there is. But of the general, I think that the swallow, being a bird, engaging in the behavior of flying, is typical of that being. And so much like the last verse, I think that there is a subtle difference between these two analogies. In the first, we have a situation in which a bird although not entirely engages in this wandering behavior, but at least in part does so, perhaps for unexplicable reasons, or perhaps because there is some need for this leisure. This leisure affords different opportunities. It's hard to say. And then swallow by flying. The bird flies for many different purposes, but that flying is a fundamental tool that they have to behave and to participate in the world and their environment. So we have, again, to smooth over this surface once more, a situation of what may appear to be some aimless behavior, purposeless behavior, that of the wandering bird. And then a situation of on one hand, it seems to be a situation of dependability that of a particular agent. We can expect that given the niche, the agent will do a particular thing, such as fly. If I were to say this sort of thing about the human experience, I would say walk. But if I imagined walking, there's often a purpose or reason behind my walking. Now, if I were to say that this analogy is directly related to the statement prior, that of the wandering bird, and then moving into that of the flying swallow, implying that it is also a creature that is just wandering aimlessly without purpose or direction, then I suppose that's one aspect and one possibility of this interpretation. The other is that there is potential, given an agent that is satisfied with its underlying needs, beginning to explore not necessarily the limits, but what can be in terms of new purposeful behavior, new techniques perhaps, that they can integrate into their experience that would enhance their experience. I think this is a part of play. A part of play is to learn and to grow. But then in terms of the swallow that flies, I imagine a bird darting to and fro, and yet I imagine an agent that is somewhat understanding of what it is doing, and that within the expression of the swallow that flies, what I am envisioning is a bird, an organism that is quite purposeful in its actions and its behaviors, especially if given constraints of resources, such that it is driven strongly by the need to fulfill its hunger or its reproductive drive. And in such situations, I think it is quite unlikely that we would see a bird waste behavior, and that it would be actively engaged most of the time in things that are actively purposeful to meet a certain end. There's a level in which I think that we can view this also, that the bird would be, we can see the bird as a particular type of agent at a particular level, and that its behaviors and its purposes are at a lower level compared to that of man. And because of that level that is lower, we may see this as something that is of an agent pursuing something that is aimless in our eyes. But that interpretation, I think, is quite simplistic, and I don't wish to go there. As the bird, by wandering, as the swallow by flying, so the curse, causeless, shall not come. So here comes what at once may seem quite simple, but in my mind is quite complex, how we connect this part to the previous analogies, because we have a few potential possibilities and interpretations of what this might mean. And so at this point, I think there are a few different paths that we can go down. One is the curse, which is the axis of this verse. We have to understand what the curse is, what it means, in order to understand what this verse potentially means. But I think rather we should start with the word causeless, because that gives us some indication of what is being implied here about the meaning of the word curse. So the causeless curse shall not come. I have to wonder if there can be such a thing as a curse without cause. It would seem to be suggested here that it is not possible. That there needs to be some precipitating factor, some logical sequence by which we can trace this curse, this event, back to, that there is a seed by which that event or the unfortunate burden is born of. Now I'd like to stop here and think about some of the implications of this. One of the interesting things, beautiful things I think, that could be said about the Bible, but more specifically the book of Proverbs, is that it slowly builds this thing in one's mind. I think it slowly builds in mind. It is substance that pours into this vessel. And what it forms, I suppose, is unique. Just like a painter may see a landscape and be inspired to paint something in particular or paint a scene, we all see these scenes a little bit differently. Perhaps we are expressing similar principles, but we are all independent agents and see things, again, from a different perspective. The thing that I think we are often prompted to consider is this relationship between things. That there is much beauty, substance within the parts of things as it's related to the whole of something, as the whole of something is related to something else. And there are so many ways that we can identify relationships. In the human context, we can see language. In the physical world, we can see relationships between different elements, fundamental particles, perhaps. All of these interactions, all of these different beginnings, for I can imagine, of the simplest of examples, moving my phone from one place to another. And I can ask myself, or I can ask another person, how did this phone come to be where it is now? The most likely answer is that somebody moved it from where it was to where it is now. There's a whole sequence that the mind would imagine about where the phone was prior to this, many of which probably is not going to be the thought that the phone was on the table and only moved a few inches to the side, as I've just done. But independent of our imaginings, there was some cause in this example of moving the physical object. If we imagine scenarios that are a little bit more sophisticated, that involve relationships between people, we can attribute feelings and the cause of feelings from within, but also from without. That the actions and behaviors of those around us, perhaps those for whom we love, influence our feelings, our emotions, the way that we see the world, quite heavily. Even if there's some dysfunction, I mentioned intrinsic causes for one's feelings to shift and to change. Even from within, we can examine and identify causes that may be the beginnings of our crisis or struggle in life, psychological dilemmas. Now, I say all of this to say that there are a lot of causes out there. The mind, as it is, can recognize that one thing, for it to come to be, must be related to something that's often out of the bounds of our awareness. The developing child, the changing composition of the particles within the atmosphere, again the shifts in the elevation, depression of our moods, all of which perhaps we are cognizant of in some way, but never seemingly in the same sort of way. That I have to imagine that within our scientific societies today, that our objective view of things, that our attempted objective view of things, to map out reality without our own perceptions, we can only make sense of it so far. Now, I don't mean to say that it is not a worthwhile pursuit to make sense of things, but rather, again, I'm trying to point my finger to the fact that causes are a necessary component of establishing being, of establishing and understanding the way that things are. And ultimately, we as these self-aware agents are able to trace back causes of things quite far. We like to examine the point at which something becomes something else. I think we are good at recognizing these patterns of existence. Now, undoubtedly, in whatever way we seem to recognize things, something contrary will come up. I had mentioned a few times that of mood and of feelings, there are these causes to these experiences. And of these causes, both of the internal and the external, have to wonder about the receptibility, the awareness of such contrary causes. Now I'm thinking about a curse. I'm trying to define what this word means. And I always refer back to personal experiences. I try to find aspects, whether it be concrete and certain, or rather a cloud and some vague image of what that experience is like, to understand something, some experience, such as a curse. Of these causes, and again of the agent that perceives these causes. It would seem to me to be that a curse is something sophisticated, surely, that it exists within the mind. It is something that is not entirely localized, I think, to the mind, in the sense that there are material causes for the curse to manifest. That really doesn't mean much, but in another way, I would have to imagine that the curse just doesn't stay within somebody. It is much like an addiction that somebody may have that they cannot escape from. At one time, there's a brief break in the overcast of clouds that the person is aware of all of their shortcomings, and perhaps not just awareness, because I think in the midst of an addiction or of a particular behavior, it doesn't have to be an addiction, a behavior that one wishes they would change about themselves, or a fundamental, maybe not fundamental, but a heavily ingrained quality about their experience that they, or their behavior that they wish to change to enhance their experience of these sorts of things in life. I don't think it's entirely safe to say that these, although they occur in the mind, I don't think that they stay within the mind. However subtle the distractions of our attention, I think, manifest in all sorts of different ways. The curse can be the cause of many behaviors. But that really doesn't explain much about what this word means. That the curse can be, that it can come to be, that it must come to be because of some cause, but it is also something that is responsible of other things. It is the cause of other things. I mentioned also that it is something that is contrary. Contrary to what exactly? I mentioned also that it is something of a burden. But I think it can be said that not all burdens are contrary. So it is not a contrary burden. It is not a responsibility that one carries for the sake of their pursuit of goodness. It is something that they carry. It is something that they are burdened by because of some event that has caused a chain of what exactly? Of what within the mind? What storm cloud? What spirit has walked down the genetic ladder to find itself ingrained within the mind, within my mind? What set of experiences may have walked down those developmental pathways to find itself now, rather than a experience that one can grow from, now it is something that binds them and restricts them? How can we also imagine such an experience overlaid a vast population, not just of one individual, but of many individuals. That of a cursed family, a town that is cursed, or a society that is cursed. And what of the temporal nature? What can we say of the existence, in a relative sense, of their lifespan? And when I say relative, I mean relative in terms of our own experience and innate understanding of time based on our finite lifespans. Now there's something that I want to say to correct or to clear up an expression earlier. When I said that it is not a contrary burden, I was speaking with regard to the word burden itself. When I was thinking that the word burden doesn't necessarily mean contrary, so to say burden in the good sense would not be a contrary burden, but a curse would be a contrary burden. Now similarly, using the word bind or binding in terms of the word curse, there are plenty of things that we are bound by, not all of them negative. Boundaries, restrictions are a part of existence. We would not have causes without these boundaries and restrictions. And I think that there is something within that, much like there is something within the idea of a burden, not necessarily being a negative thing full stop, but again, since we are talking about causes, there's a particular way in which these causes are oriented such that they appear to us in one way or another, whether we consider something to be good or we consider to be something to be bad. In the case of binding or restriction, for example, the room that I'm in can be seen as something that is a facilitator of home, of relief, of contemplation, of learning, or it could be seen as a prison. There are plenty of rooms that exist that are, the purpose of those rooms are to house and to restrict one's physical and cognitive movements. So what we have now of this curse is that it is something that requires some previous relationship to come to be. It can be the impetus for causes down the line ahead of it. It is something of a burden, but not strictly a burden. It is a contrary burden. There's a negativity associated with it. Of this contrary burden, it is something that can be formed of many different things. There are many different ways in which one can become aware of something. We have plenty of different senses to identify whether or not the temperature outside is, or not the temperature maybe, but perhaps the weather more generally is that of precipitation or not. We can tell by the feel of the humidity in the air. We can tell by the smell. We can tell by our feeling. We can tell by feeling in the sense of our cutaneous sensation, but also in terms of our visual sensation. In a like manner, we can, I think, also understand and attend to contrary burdens through various sources or stimuli. It may not mean anything to us, I think, in the immediate moment, just like if it's raining outside, it might not mean anything to us immediately. But there will be an effect that we cannot necessarily ignore if we are to examine a problem and find the root of why something is causing us to be aware of something. In the case of this curse, I'd have to imagine that it may manifest in terms of proclivities, desires, baseline feelings, baseline emotions, the way in which we relate ourselves to other people, to other things. The curse, much like the rain, is something that is dynamic, as all things seem to be. So the curse causeless shall not come. So I hope at this point we have some understanding of what this curse is. And I haven't necessarily touched on the supernatural, but I don't think it's necessary, because if we are thinking about the abundance of causes for which things can come to be, I think we can imagine within that agentic arena, we can be influenced by all sorts of fascinating and strange phenomena that we don't necessarily need to identify every single one of them to understand how this can be. The awareness of such an experience is enough. Now, before I move on, a thought just occurred to me that I think that there is a need to say something a little bit farther. Because right now in my mind it seems to be this thing that is slippery. Almost as if the curse doesn't really have an identity in and of itself. Now I think that in order to give an identity there must be some personal example, of which in my mind I can find a few, but I'm not sure this is the most productive way to finish what I want to finish here in terms of the word curse. I'm looking at this definition here on Google. Sometimes I wonder how far we can actually get with these definitions. But of the first it says, a solemn utterance intended to invoke a supernatural power to inflict harm or punishment on someone or something. A coarse or blasphemous word or phrase used to express anger or other strong emotion. The cause of harm or misery. It's kind of funny here. There is an informal definition, and then under that it says menstruation. But I like the subpoint, a cause of harm or misery, because what I'm after is, I think, that ground foundational level. I suppose that we can talk about foundational level being the root cause, and that could be rooted in some supernatural thing, but rather I would like to focus on the subject being the person that is receiving this curse. And as such, our general awareness that this thing has now occurred is enough for me. The causes, we already know that something has caused it to be. I'm not sure how much tracing it back, at least at this time, is going to provide us with any real benefit. But again, rather to focus on this, a cause of harm or misery, I would like to restrict us to the linguistic domain. And moreover from that, I would like to restrict us to the meaningful elements of the linguistic domain, because there's a lot of things that can be said that would fall on deaf ears, that while it may mean something to us, if we can't develop a strong relationship, the cause may not have enough activation energy in order for that domino effect of causes to occur. And as a result, the curse would not take hold. Now I want to focus on the linguistic domain because I think culturally we find the curse here, even in this definition, a solemn utterance intended to invoke a supernatural power to inflict harm or punishment on someone or something. Again, I want to draw the attention towards the pointedness of this. That it is not arbitrary, that it actually does have meaning, that it is built within the structure of mind. It is not something that is just like a breeze or something just generally inattentive. It is something that is within the awareness. Now, whether or not somebody chooses to attend to it is another matter. That might sound kind of counterintuitive or contradictory, but I think it is possible. I think it could be said of pain that one may be generally aware of their pain but not necessarily attending to it. That it is always at the level of conscious awareness, but it doesn't take the prime seat. Or emotional damage, I think this can be another sort of thing. We can feel in a depressed state, but we can continue to perform and interact with others in a way that this depressed state isn't the primary focus of our experience. Or I could say that of the opposite. It doesn't necessarily have to be an inherently depressing set of examples here. It would seem that there's a form of a curse that is descending upon the American people at this moment. Such a strange time to be alive. And I have to wonder, since we are on this verge of the artificial intelligence revolution, or we're going through it right now, we're having dramatic changes, almost like a dam that has just broke to our system of governance. There is conflict in multiple domains, multiple geographic places across the earth. There is a legacy of a particular type of thought that has found its way parasitically into the mind of the citizenry of the United States. It's something that I am fighting against every day. A cultural contagion, a curse that rides on the collective mind. Something that wishes to take the bonds that are necessary to maintain solid identity and society, relationships involving more than one person, more than just a small collective of people, and nestling its way into that link, into the bond that makes up those barriers, those boundaries of identity, but also of relationships. And of those of identity, I think we can experience it the most readily. Perhaps some of us, I don't know. Maybe it's more relational for others, but in my own case, I think it is quite individual. The struggle, that is. The recognition of the curse like it is something that of pain that I feel as though I have had for some time, but now I'm thinking that it is not normal, whereas before perhaps I thought it was normal. And there are multiple domains of this. It's possible to be cursed by more than one thing, I suppose. But if I take my own personal experiences that have nothing to do with the larger collective consciousness, and I just think about the cultural bonds that I have, and how they are beginning to change, and how the change in these bonds are tempting, since this is a contrary, potentially harmful burden, that they are connecting themselves with the other links in my mind that are parasitic, that before anything was wrong within the collective sphere, within the philosophical, cultural sphere, or the political domain, or the religious domain, whatever domain it happens to be, since the curse at this level is quite strong and broad, we can apply it, I think, to any domain. But again, it has found its way. It has found friends that it wishes to connect with, to bind with. Friends of perhaps evil that wish to tempt my behavior in one particular direction or another. Mostly this manifests in terms of inattentiveness and the desire to do nothing. Or, more insidiously perhaps, it is the failure to recognize that doing nothing is actually a bad thing. Now, I will say that I am not somebody who does nothing. For most of the time, I am quite involved with my work life and also personal pursuits. But there are times in which I know that I need to be doing more than I am. And at the times where I feel like I need the rest the most are the times that I actually need to put forward the strongest effort. Now, what I'm curious about, with all of that being said, is the relationship that this causeless, or improbably, that would not be the right word to use. I'll just say that this curse, how it relates to what was said previously, as the bird by wandering, as the swallow by flying. Now, I mentioned earlier that there was one possible interpretation that we can say that the birds do nothing but sort of wander aimlessly through their existence. And that it appears that their movements and their sharp direction changes, flying from this branch to the next and calling out, really has no purpose or meaning, but I don't think that this is true at all. I mentioned that there was a possibility that the wandering bird can explore outside of the purposeful domain and try to find new purposes that they had before not necessarily engaged in. And I mentioned this to be a play type of situation. And now I'm wondering that it is possible that within this play, since it is not necessarily directed towards that of things that readily to an organism at that level of experience would be contrary to it, such as procreation or procuring food to eat or shelter, whatever that might be. All of that behavior is very productive. It's something that should be done. But of play, it's possible that, whether it be because of the time that is spent or of the type of behavior that they're engaging in, that they are actually doing something that is unproductive. That by this wandering behavior, that the curse enters in, that the bird finds something to do with their time that is taking away from other fundamental tasks. Now, the wandering human being is much more dangerous than the wandering bird, I think. For the mind has a lot more places to go than the mind of a bird. The second, as the swallow by flying. Here again is a potential interpretation of a swallow, of a bird that is flying, that is darting to and fro without purpose, without direction. Without cause. Now it is possible that this can be another way that we can associate the behavior with play, that it is some purposeful, purposeless behavior, or purposeful in the sense that its purpose is actually diminished relative to that of survival purposes. But with play, I would like it to be known that I think that it is something that is potentially damaging, but also, much like the situation of the burden or that of restriction or binding, there are ways in which there are positive burdens, and there are ways in which there are positive restrictions and of binding. In a like manner, there are ways in which the wandering behavior is bad. It can lead to terrible things, but also I think that it can lead to beautiful things, new types of behavior, new forms of understanding, new ways of seeing, maybe I should say. And so the relationship that is drawn here, so the curses causeless shall not come, that there is something quite ingrained about the causeless nature of one's behavior. But I wonder about the interpretation here, or I wonder about the translation from the original, and I wonder if causeless was actually the word that was used, or rather the meaning of causeless. Because while at one level I understand what is being said here, it would seem to be the case that nothing can truly be causeless, but it would appear causeless to us if it has very little value. But it still has cause, even if the cause is towards, volitionally towards engaging in behavior that has no value. That's still something that is causing us to do something. Now I understand that we're coming from two different avenues here. In the first, we're talking about the birds whose behavior has some cause, or again, so something can cause the bird's behavior, but then the bird can also cause its behavior to be. Again, it's this sort of forward and then approaching from behind imagery that I'm trying to play with here. And in the second instance, we're talking about the cause of the burden. So I wonder, this cause in the forward sense, in which an organism might engage in behavior, playful type behavior. Let's move past playful behavior and say again, perhaps behavior that is towards an interface with the world that doesn't necessarily have much to offer the organism or to improve its value or relational value. That instead of becoming more and better, greater, becoming good, it becomes weaker, lesser, unfit evil. Of the type of the behavior that we started talking about as playful, but now is potentially going down the path of evil towards nothingness, towards the absence of existence. By this type of wandering, we say that it has a cause, but a cause that is unfortunate, that is lesser. We will not say that this sort of thing, regardless of the value of the cause of the behavior, does not exist. The cause most surely exists, otherwise the behavior wouldn't exist. So in one sense it's a strange comparison, because as we go backwards, starting from the second half of the verse, we're prompted to consider something that is harmful, like the curse, and then lay that over our initial interpretation, which doesn't necessarily have anything to do with harm, but it's highly contextual. It's beautiful, really, the way that this is woven together, if one goes through it from top to bottom and then traces it back up to the first. So what can be said then overall about this verse? As the bird by wandering, as the swallow by flying, so the curse causeless shall not come. Again, I think if this is read quickly, it's easy to go with the first interpretation, or the superficial, maybe not superficial, but in the sense that, again, the birds have no control over their behavior. It's purposeless, and by that seeming observation, the curse is unlike this, in the sense that it is not causeless, or that the curse causeless shall not come. But also there's another way again of seeing this. That within the up and down, the platonic opposites, for which everything positive seemingly has some negative way it can be perceived or seen or related, of a negative cause, especially since we are considering the harmful effects of a curse. The way in which a bird can wander can effectively make it seem as though there is no cause, but rather, I think more accurately, it can be said that its behavior is negative. It is towards the antithesis of their existence or their survival. And by this choice, and by this path of navigating opposites, we find that even in scenarios that may appear to us to be causeless, actually do have a cause. And so we need to be careful about the decisions that we make, even if we are being playful about our decisions. The wandering can lead us to something that would appear of a world that is causeless, that makes us see a world that is causeless. I think that can be a sort of a curse in and of itself. A whip for the horse, a bridle for the ass, and a rod for the fool's back. So today is a new day. A new day, new thoughts. It happens to be a Sunday today. A Sunday night. It's after dinner. I am in a particular type of mood, waiting for the week to begin. And it's not a negative mood, certainly. But it is one of preparation, of considering the final day of the week, of rest. And I'm eager to dive into this and to make something of it, and to have a productive session today. So much like the last two verses, we are starting with a double analogy. And then it is centered around the last part of the verse, which of course what we are going to be talking about most heavily is the fool. So a whip for the horse and a bridle for the ass. So what can we say about this? Now, whip for the horse, to me this is something that implies discipline. That in order for us to tame the horse, to train it to do, or to be in line with our wishes and our desires, discipline is a fundamental component of that. I happen to be a person that lives as a modern person in a city, 21st century city individual. And the analogies that are floating through my mind have to do with domesticated dogs and domesticated cats, because I've had experience with both. And I've also experienced situations in which the pets of other individuals, situations in which these animals are not trained well, that they are poorly behaved, that they were not disciplined. And there's something quite powerful about an animal that is both loved but also appropriately disciplined, whether it be a companion or an animal that may be considered a beast of burden. Now, a horse has many facets to it, especially in the ancient world. Now, a bridle for the ass. A bridle is the bit and the reins that go around the snout of the animal. That allows us to direct it, to guide it. Again, it's a tool to direct its motion for our own ends, for our own purposes. But this analogy is slightly different than the whip for the horse. It's not a disciplinary tool. It's a guiding tool. And a rod for the fool's back. Now, unlike the whip or the bridle, the rod can be seen as a tool of authority, a tool of power. In addition to the rod, I think we can think of a staff or a scepter. There can be certain symbolic connotations to it. But I think it includes both the disciplinary element, but also the guiding element. Now, this is not the first time that we are seeing this symbol of the rod. And the reason that I say that it's a symbol of authority is because usually that's the context in which we find it. Now, I'd like to take a moment and dive into some of these topics. The guiding element, the disciplinary element, and also the tool of authority, and how exactly that might be utilized against a fool. Because surely, as we see in this verse, what might be appropriate is disciplinary, but also guiding, leading. So let's begin with the first. A whip for the horse. Of discipline, let's begin with the etymology of this word. So let's begin with the Latin roots. Discipline comes from the Latin word disciplina, which means instruction, knowledge. That in turn is derived from the word discipulus, meaning pupil or student, which is the root of the English word disciple. The Latin word discere means to learn. Now this word is quite similar to the first that we had mentioned. Of the Old French, it was adopted as the word discipline, which retained the meanings of teaching, but also suffering and martyrdom. We have Middle English, used both to refer to the act of teaching and the system of rules governing behavior. Over time, it took on an additional meaning, training to act in accordance with the rules, or punishment intended to correct. So I found this kind of interesting. In my mind, I had, of course, since we were talking about the horse and the whip, my mind went to discipline first in terms of the meaning of the word. But of course, all of us understand that the word discipline encompasses more than just the punishment for purposes of correction. I exercise discipline every time that I attempt to read the Bible, to interpret it, every time I exercise, or every time I go to work. And that type of discipline is adherence to, or a commitment to a particular task. There's virtue that is wound up within that type of discipline. It includes strongly the component of knowledge and of learning within it. Now, in terms of the contemporary meaning, discipline can refer to a branch of knowledge, a system of rules or practices, or the act of training someone to follow the rules. It's also commonly used in the context of self-control or the practice of enforcing order, which I think is more akin to what I just mentioned. But this is a fascinating evolution of the word. The root, I think, is telling, foundational, and important. This, I think, gets closer to what we will be discussing in terms of the symbolism of the rod. But to linger here for a moment about this teaching and learning and the disciple or the student. In this illustration, the horse, of course, is the recipient of this discipline. but also by extension, since these analogies are wound up within the rod, I think, it is also used against the fool. So although we use the whip or the rod as a tool of physical discipline to ensure that a particular behavior is not repeated, there is a larger purpose that we have in mind, and I think that this is the primary thing that we should be focusing on. And I think what we are prompted to consider here, especially fairly soon when we get to the fool, is not only to think of how we may guide or discipline, given that we are in the appropriate situation, somebody that we might deem a fool, or the aspects, the elements of ourselves that can be said to be foolish. And of these elements, I don't think it's something that can be completely stamped out of the human experience. I think it's something that we fight against, we control for, if we are faithful, if we are self-reflective. And so although the first analogy is quite crude, and that for the horse it does not require much sophistication. I suppose we can say that there is sophistication when bringing up a horse and training it and taking only one aspect of this word discipline, or of that modern aspect, and of the French editions, in which we have that components of suffering, of falling in line, of this restoration of order for, again, some purpose, to fulfill the goal of raising this animal to work for us, to carry whatever burden, whatever load, to complete whatever task. More important, I think we should keep in mind that this word discipline comes to us from that of disciple, that of learning, instruction, knowledge. And while it is necessary, and I think about myself when I was a child, the child really doesn't know better, much like the horse, in terms of what world he will be entering into, what type of behavior that he will be expected to have to be successful in that world. Learning and instruction, being a student, a part of that is going to involve falling into some order, some structured composition by which he or she shall learn certain fundamentals. Now, hopefully, there will be a teacher present that can make the fundamentals tolerable to learn, or enjoyable to learn. But at a certain point, the fundamentals are the fundamentals, and there needs to be a certain degree of that authoritative discipline to get all that information in. On the flip side of that, knowledge is a complex topic. It's not a simple and straightforward matter as learning the fundamentals, of memorizing the multiplication tables, of learning the rules of grammar, of learning how to read and write, spell. We do these things, again, for some purpose. Our purpose, perhaps, at the time, and now this is where my mind goes back to a good teacher. If we have a good teacher, I think the purpose will always be there, so we're not just sort of aimlessly learning fundamentals, although important they may be. In the case of the horse, I have to think, with my experience of animals that I've had so far, the authoritative discipline will only go so far, and their reciprocation, their love for you, will require more than just that discipline. They may fall in line, but their relationship with you will suffer if you do not teach them other things, if you do not instruct them in love and how to reciprocate that emotion. Now, a bridle for the ass, this concept of guiding, I find quite fascinating. For to guide is not it's not too much different than that of discipline, that of some instruction. But if we can say anything of its difference, we may say that perhaps this is a highlight of the aspect of discipline that we ought to be focusing on, instead of that straight whip physical discipline to fall in line, to restore the order. Now here we have a guide that is showing us the way home, showing us a way to purpose, showing us a way to attend to our purposes appropriately. In the case that we are exposed to here, in terms of what I would imagine to be probably a farmer of some sort, or even a merchant. I suppose there's a cynical view of this wound up in here somewhere, but this is not where our faith will bring us. But there is a subjection. There is a relationship of the subject and the authority or the master. And the master in this situation understands that there is an elevated purpose, and that his discipline is going to be the thing, because of his understanding, is going to be the thing that directs the animal or the fool to the appropriate purpose or outcome. Now, with regard to the rod for the fool's back, the fool, again, is this person that is at the low rung of the hierarchy. In the Proverbs, there's a pattern of 3 words that come often together: that of the fool, that of the wicked person, and that of evil. All of them share certain qualities. The fool, being at the lowest of the rung, is the one that probably doesn't necessarily understand why his behaviors are significant and why he should or should not participate in something in the way that he does. The fool is often a person that is either self-absorbed or too preoccupied by something that takes up their attention, that they are unable to focus on good purposes or a purpose in general. I think a lot of my own shortcomings have to do with my failure to allocate attention appropriately. And it's not just attending to one particular task, but the overall purpose for which my attention to various tasks is directed. That also is another point at which the fool, or at times the aspect of myself, does not agree with the higher order of things. And the higher order in this sense would be towards purposes that would lead me to be a better person, that would cause me to grow, to learn, to be closer to God, in the sense that I'm closer to the source of being, and fulfilling a high purpose for the human being, and recognizing the shortcomings that I may see in others are shortcomings that I undoubtedly have seen in myself. And it is the fool that fails to recognize the errors of his ways, that fails to understand, that fails to take the initiative to orient their attention to make that sacrifice, however painful it might be, to wake themselves up from that stupor of dulled experience, and to continue fighting and looking for something greater, for some better purpose, for paying attention to when they have committed some wrong, however painful that discipline might be, however painful a correction in one's behavior might be. And so this rod for the fool's back, I think, involves this strict, orderly discipline, for which it doesn't necessarily matter in the immediate moment why one has to fall in line. But then also the more sophisticated type, where understanding, knowledge, instruction comes in, that this order is for a purpose, and that without a structured way of things, behavior, attention will go anywhere. It will grab onto anything. It will be a seed that grows in any field. Or maybe I should say, it'll be a particular type of seed that grows in a particular type of field, inherently a limiting experience. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest then also be like unto him. So from my perspective, it would seem that the primary word that we have to focus on here in the beginning is the word accord. According to his folly. Answer not a fool according to his folly. I think there's much that could be said about the word fool and also about the word folly. But if we can't understand this word accord and how it relates or connects this fool and his folly, then I'm unable to understand the verse. So thinking about the word accord, the definition here: give or grant someone power, status, or recognition of the second, of a concept or a fact, be harmonious or consistent with. Now, just taking the basic idea of answering somebody in accordance or according to something, I find interesting. And my mind is curious to understand exactly what landscape we are opening here. If we are to be harmonious with something, surely we can find ourselves in agreement with all sorts of different things. We can force ourselves to coincide with something that we disagree with, and yet we can go along with somebody because of the way they interact with us, the path that they offer, that information exchange is afforded by, I want to say, characteristics, by qualities, more accurately, I think, by behaviors, by temperament, by disposition. When I consider myself and I think about how I approach somebody and how opened or reserved I am to a particular discussion or a particular individual, what I am asking somebody to accord with, if they are to interact with me, will depend on my willingness to engage with them on multiple different fronts, to go down multiple different roads. Now, we may have a particular point of attention. There may be some reason that myself and somebody else are engaging in a conversation. Occupationally, it would seem to be the easiest example, because in this situation, I am the proprietor communicating with some consumer. Now, of course, that's a very specific set of things that we are going to talk about. And so when I say that there's multiple roads that we can go down, I don't necessarily mean that there are multiple topics. This is a possibility, but just to narrow this down a little bit, what I mean to say when I say multiple roads that we can go down and explore, more so what I mean is, like in the context of this verse, the road in this situation is the fool. The fool is a type of ontological projection. There's a particular type of person, a being that is wound up here. And when I say multiple roads, I've had this experience actually just yesterday, on Sunday. I felt, for whatever reason, defensive. Defensive in the face of somebody that I love, I admire. I'm not sure why this feeling came to be, but it severely restricted our level of discourse. My responses were short. The responses that were had on my part were limited, only so much that the other person that I was talking to could accord with, again, those limited set of data points in order to project herself forward onto something else, a different conversation, or to further the conversation. And this road, as I look back on it now, seems to be a bit foolish. But there are plenty of things that I could have done. I could have kept it very open. I could have directed it slightly. Of course, the being that we all wish to be is the being that draws ourselves and others closer to God, the faithful being. But at times it seems to be a bit difficult to maintain a strong, to have a strong control, to be in control over all of the various emotions, over all of the events and experiences, and integrate them in such a way that we can completely separate our fatigue and our frustrations from somebody that doesn't deserve to be involved in that experience. Certainly we should try our best to afford somebody, if we are communicating with them, a road that is good, a road that is generous, a road that is righteous and productive. So going back to this road, I'm considering the fool. What we are according with here, perhaps I could say what we are agreeing with, again, what we are in line with or in parallel with, the road that we have to use to move towards a particular destination, to move from point A to point B, to, in the case of conversation, to transmit information from one person to another. It would seem that the foolish road is the option that we are considering here. And the accordance is the fact that of the two lanes on this road, the information going out is my expression to somebody else. The information coming in is the inbound lane. And this is how we accord. But again, I want to reiterate that within the plane, within the domain of accordance, I think we can have this rich infrastructure such that we are not limited by the narrow confines and procedures of the foolish way, of the foolish person, then that brings me to my next issue or situation. What is the narrow confines? What necessarily is this infrastructure bound by, if it is to be the foolish road by which we are taking collectively together, myself and this other person in this conversation? So I have in front of me a quarter that was minted in 1980. Now, there are various things about this quarter that I can identify. Now, I call it a quarter. It has a name because it has various things for which I can identify it, certain characteristics. There are pillars of its identity that are fundamental to it. Some of these pillars depend on my place in the world, that I live in the United States, that the quarter that I hold is a particular type of currency, that I know it looks a particular way. I know that it has a particular president. I know that there is a particular bird on the back of the coin. I know that the coin is a circle. I know that there are two primary metal components that make up this coin. Now, I say this because as I look at this thing, its identity seems to me to be so clear. This visual input affords me so much about identifying this object, and it doesn't take much scientific rigor to determine the reality of the object. My experience of this world and of the interface that I have with this object is sufficient for me to understand it. At least to understand it at this level. And of course it's created to be articulated with at this level. Now, if I were to replace in my mind this quarter for the identity of the fool, the question that I have for myself is, what qualities of this object now that you hold describes this fool? Now, I've gone through this already at least once in this episode, but every time I do, I feel like I find something a little bit more that I had not quite looked at. Just like looking at this quarter, there are certain intricacies that I didn't quite notice before that I notice now. Some perhaps are unique to the quarter that other quarters do not possess, but also some are fundamental to the structure that all quarters share. Now, of the fool is somebody that chooses not to see. And this idea of choice may be debated a little bit, but of the fool, there's often not much deliberation. And that is to say, from the personal perspective, from the fool's perspective, there's not much deliberation about their behavior. Perhaps they are dictated by their immediate desires or feelings. Perhaps they don't consider how various things are related to one another. What makes somebody foolish, I think, is often their lack of attention to detail, but also, again, towards contextual cues. If somebody is acting a fool outside of a comedic situation, they are often behaving inappropriately for the situation because they are not attending to the purpose at hand. It would be a foolish thing to do if a carpenter were to cut a wood for a windowsill if he is tasked with framing a door. Now, this person does not fall to the level of evil, or even the level of the wicked person, because their intent, their desire to take away and to disintegrate really is not there. It doesn't necessarily exist. But rather it is by extension of their behavior and their poor decision making that their behavior may lead to similar outcomes as some of the more malevolent forms of being. But if we go back to our road and we say, okay, we have identified something fundamental about the fool, that he is a person that poorly identifies the purpose of his behavior, of his actions, of his thoughts, and of his desires. He is a person that poorly integrates all of these things together towards productive ends. And a person such as this, we can imagine how a conversation would go. It would be unproductive. It would be a conversation that lacked attention or any real purpose. It would be silly in a way. Again, if it's comedic for a comedic purpose, then fine. But in this situation, it is we are considering a serious situation. Serious in the sense that we are wishing to accomplish some task, and the task is frustrated by the fool's behavior. Again, lack of attention, poor understanding of the goal or the task at hand. And so for a man that wishes to solve a problem, they cannot communicate along the same road because they will not solve the problem. They will not be productive. And so a new road must be forged. It must be taken. And a fool can come on a new road, surely. And I think a fool would benefit from taking a different road. Though it may take some time for the fool to travel down it and to learn what that road has to truly offer. Certainly at some point, the fool that travels a road that is different than his own, the foolish road, he would no longer become a fool in time. Answer not a fool according to his folly. Now his folly, I won't spend too much time on this, is the outcome of his being. It is his behavior. It is the locus of his attention. It is his ability to problem solve. His ability to effectively manage his emotions. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you also be like him. Now the reason for this is something that I've already explored a little bit, but I'd like to flesh this out a little bit more. I think of myself, I think I have foolish elements of me. But again, looking at this quarter, if I were to reduce myself to this object, and as I turn it to and fro between my fingers, if I were to do the same with my own individual identity, I don't think that the pillars of this object of myself would fundamentally be consisted of foolish pillars, though I would not go as far to say that I am completely free of foolish impropriety. And I would also have to imagine that many people are similar. some more foolish than others. Some days perhaps we demonstrate more qualities of the fool than others. Perhaps there are periods of our lives for which we demonstrate or occupy that character. Perhaps only within a particular friend group do we occupy the character of the fool. Regardless of the situation, going back to what it means necessarily to answer the fool. In accordance with his ways. If we imagine a healthy situation, a good day, in which we are focused, we are disciplined, we take on the responsibilities that are put before us during a given day. We approach our problems with vigor and come to solutions with diligence and completeness. The question being, how does the fool's identity limit this productive capacity? Again, attention, I have to come back to and say that this is fundamental. That if we are not attending to a task, that if we are not paying attention to the elements that make up a problem, if we are not organizing particular things in such a way that allow us to see where to go next, how to logically integrate our thoughts into something that is reasonable, something that is coherent, something that agrees. Again, something that leads to an outcome that is productive. If I am a carpenter and I am communicating with a consumer that is wishing, that is asking for my services, I must be able to understand and project based on what I see, what I observe, what I witness, and examine potential solutions to the things that I observe. And I would not be able to do so if I'm unable to hold within the center or the locus of my attention the important components of the problem. Or, for example, if I turn the conversation into something that is significantly off path, that is not just lighthearted conversation to build rapport, but it is done in such a way that takes the mind off completely from the task at hand and takes away from the other individual, that brings him down my path, my foolish path, again away from the entire purpose of why we are communicating, then there is no way that we would be able to see the solution to the problem, because we cannot see the elements that are necessary to integrate to solve the problem. Now that might seem kind of like a strange example, but it makes sense in my mind. Hopefully it's not foolish. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. Now this is the follow-up verse. This is verse 5. An interesting play on the previous verse. There's often a pattern in the Proverbs of one verse being related to another, but this type of playfulness we don't see as often. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you also be like unto him. Answer to a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. So let's begin with the first half. What does it mean, now that we've described what it means not to answer a fool according to his folly? What does it mean to answer a fool according to his folly? Well, that would mean to take that road of foolishness, to disrupt our attention, to find ourselves lost within the mind's wandering for the sake of wandering, skirting our responsibilities. Being either incapable or severely diminished in our capacity to synthesize and to organize information into any meaningful way. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. Now I find this verse fascinating, especially coming off of the last verse, for we have to keep the last verse in mind. Otherwise we'd run into trouble. Because I don't think it's saying that we should in totality answer a fool according to his folly. We are instructed to answer not a fool according to his folly. Otherwise we'd become like him. But perhaps there's a situation in which we have to follow that path for a short amount of time. We retain a broader perspective, such that we are not necessarily a fool in terms of our identity, but we assume that identity temporarily, or elements of it, so that we can understand, but also remove the possibility of the fool finding himself lost within himself. That would then lead to the types of behaviors, thoughts that find wickedness, that find evil, of the things that really delude the self when pride is put upon the pedestal. For conceit is this idea of this excessive pride, narcissism, vanity. The autoaxial, for which the axis that the person revolves around, instead of it being God, to orient himself to that which is true, he revolves around himself, and what is true is whatever his self dictates is true. Of course, there's not much greater folly than this sort of experience, for it's impossible to have an identity that's independent of everything else unless it is God. So it cannot be ourselves because we are not gods. So I think what we are being prompted to consider here is a type of neighborly love, that we follow down the path that the fool takes us, so that we can prevent the fool from taking the turn inward, and instead playfully, gently coax the traveler onto a different path, onto a different road of being. Another thing that we are prompted to consider here is what exactly it means to be lost within the self. We are asked to consider what the consequences are of thinking oneself to be wise, but the wisdom is placed within pride, within conceit. So the first thing that I would like to discuss is the possibility of placing wisdom within pride and conceit. I wonder if this is not a contradiction, if this is something that is just not possible. So far I've been using the word wisdom as the way in which a person maps their reality. It's more than just a map. I think it also percolates into their behavior, into their being. It's the way in which they are. It's the way in which they choose to be. Fundamentally, I think wisdom is something that is of a person's capacity to bind, full stop. So it could be to bind communities together, people together. It could be to bind concepts together, to bind pieces of information together. All of these possibilities that for which a person can exercise this binding potential, I think is bound up within wisdom. There's an additional component to that, I think, which implies that the person that is doing the binding, that is doing the observing, integrating and synthesizing the information is a just judge, that they can appropriately and honestly justify their accounts. Wisdom, I think, is a broad umbrella that includes terms like knowledge and understanding. But to explore the possibility that a person can be called wise but also can be conceited seems to be a contradiction. It seems like it would be not possible for the two to exist side by side. Moreover, from that, if we consider that we are speaking about a foolish person, and that if not a fool is on the opposite side as the term wisdom, I don't know what would be. It certainly seems like an antonym. But nonetheless, we can imagine a situation in which there is a fool that possesses a degree of understanding, but understanding with self-imposed constraints. Truths that are only really seen from a particular perspective, that satisfy the internal desires, that fulfill one's expectations, and everything to the contrary, the entirety of the truth, the big picture for which a truly wise person has to navigate and to identify. This sort of thing is willfully cast aside, again, for the pursuits of the individual interest. Now I want to bring back a thought from the previous verse, that of going down this foolish road, and how this road is sort of a connection point, or just generally a connection between two agents, and that the road is shared between the two agents. Of this path, the individuals can occupy a variety of states of being. One of the potential states of being is that state of foolishness. And given this state of foolishness, given that we are traveling this road, we are afforded certain constraints. We cannot go off the path without introducing a different way of seeing the world, understanding things, approaching problems, or connecting with people. So if we keep this in mind, I come back to the question in my head about what it means necessarily to be wise in something. Almost like wisdom, in this sense, is a hostage, a captive that is taken by some agent. Its potential is much reduced, and by this I've already inquired, of its ability reduced, I have to wonder about its identity. Are we not disrupting something here that would cause it to be a contradiction in terms? But pushing that aside for the moment, if we imagine this wisdom to be overshadowed by some agent, the form of wisdom, let's say, is overshadowed by the agent, and all around this wisdom we have these iron bars that just come crashing down onto the surface beneath, and they are so tightly packed together that this formal wisdom cannot escape. It is trapped within something. Certainly part of it is ruined. There's an aspect of its of what it is that must be open and exposed to the rest of the environment. And so perhaps it's a different thing, perhaps not. Again, I wanted to push that aside. But we have some semblance of wisdom, much like we have perhaps an old car that drives past us, and we can smell the gasoline that comes off of the exhaust, or a boat. I think of that particular example. And as it has moved past, we no longer see it, but we can smell that it was present at one time. And this is how I imagine the relationship of the wisdom in foolishness, foolish conceit. That the fool perhaps has some understanding of what wisdom is, has some understanding, some ability to perceive it, just as one perceives the fumes coming off of an old vehicle. But he is unable to utilize the vehicle. His perception is limited, as we can imagine, outside of using a vehicle. Other ways that we can tell of its existence, other than the fumes, are its physical presence, and perhaps the sound that it makes, that vibration in the earth, perhaps we can feel. And so when I say that the identity of this thing is much reduced, if we try to encapsulate the identity of a car in the aspect of its fumes, we can get some understanding of its existence, but we would be severely diminished. We wouldn't understand a lot about what we are picking up on or identifying, first and foremost. But secondly, this might be perhaps the most important, is that the car, as a tool, we being the foolish person that is stuck within himself, is unable to utilize the car as a tool to get from point A to point B, to carry heavy objects, to do whatever it is one might do with a motorized vehicle. So that brings us to this, lest he be wise in his own conceit. Lest he be wise in his own conceit. Stuck within it. Limited to that minimal perception. That poor understanding. And what I hope that this outlines, that this illustrates, is that it's not just a matter of simple perception. There are various pieces of the puzzle that are not only required by different aspects of our perception. Going off of the analogy again, it's not just smell that we interact with something, or that we come to know something. But it's not just by our perceptions either. It is by an experience of mind that demonstrates its own agency and its will, that uses the material substrate for which it recognizes its existence to accomplish certain things, to execute tasks, to fulfill certain purposes, or to design things that have some purpose to meet certain ends. And an agent that is severely limited in their capacity to do that is not going to be able to offer society much, or they're going to be limited in their ability to do it. They will be limited in their relationships. And if they are to be stuck within themselves, then the very idea of what it means to be wise and to connect things will be nothing but a fleeting glimpse into what is actually possible for the mind. Now, it's easy, I think, to go outside of this experience, or even just to go into the tails of that statistical distribution and to examine the extremes of the capabilities of the human mind, but also the unfortunate ailments, whether it be an Alzheimer's situation or an extreme form of autism or other cognitive impairment for which the human experience is diminished for whatever reason it might be. In this situation, I suppose it's not necessarily the same thing. We're not talking about a fool. But on some level there are many parallels. That the mind, in its diminished state, outside of the willful degradation of its own experience, can experience something akin to that of the relatively average human being that has, again, willfully diminished his own cognitive capacity. In the extreme situation, there may be genius level individuals that may look back on that statistical average and say something to him or herself about the foolish nature of humanity, because this person is so far ahead cognitively. Their awareness of how to utilize the tools of our environment and of the mind far exceed the normal human being. And I think this too also would have a lot of parallels. But the thing, again, that I want to come back to is that the fool in this situation, I think we are thinking about a person that is of relatively average means. This could include a genius level person, but a person that willfully, and a person that is beneath average standards, I should say. This is a person that willfully decides to limit their own experience. Now, that willful decision may be because of a false belief, and they may not understand that the decision that they have made is actually putting them back, putting that formal wisdom in that prison, as it were. Now, I would like to go over this thought about the shared infrastructure that two individuals may be engaged in some dialogue, that foolish infrastructure. Thinking about the last verse, that we ought not to answer a fool according to his folly, lest we also be like him. And then the second verse saying, answer a fool according to his folly. This, of course, raises the risk of us becoming like the fool. But then there's this what seems to be this act of selflessness that occurs because we give in to the fool's rules, I should say. Again, the infrastructure is set that the car doesn't necessarily drive off of the road to get to the destination sooner. The car stays on the road. There are many reasons for that. But certainly I think it could be said that the road of the fool is not the straight and narrow. It is not the road that is most expedient. And in fact, it may not even get us to our destination. So if we are left with the rising possibility or risk of becoming foolish by playing the game of the fool, and we are asked to consider the individual of the fool, I think what we're essentially being asked is to consider the soul of this person. And the wager here is, do we risk our minds falling into a foolish trap? Or do we see a fellow man fall into a trap that is worse than foolishness? It is by his own auto-actualization that he deceives himself into some understanding of what is. And much like a person that falls down a deep hole, the light from above fades faster and faster and faster as he falls deeper and deeper, almost like one that would fall into a well. And we are being asked to participate in his game so he doesn't fall down that well. And of course the wager is that maybe I shouldn't say wager, but we are being asked to save him. And although we are participating in the foolish game, there seems to me to be a sense in which, even if we are on that road, the foolish path, with the fool, if we are to be somebody of a being that is fundamentally not oriented towards foolishness, even if we walk down the path of the fool with the fool, we can still recognize how that path would limit us and how we ought to change course, change direction. And I think that this sort of thing is evidenced by the fact that we recognize the potential for the fool or the man's soul to be lost within himself. And by that, it seems like what we are being asked to do is to participate in the game so he doesn't fall into it. But of course, there's more than that. So he doesn't fall into it, and then the obvious secondary to that is to get this person off of the foolish path. So it's best not to play the game of the fool so we don't end up becoming the fool. But if the fool is a person who is willing to sacrifice their own soul for their foolishness, then we have to be patient. Be faithful while we coach the man and facilitate the flourishing of the soul until it exits the danger zone, and then we can liberate ourselves from those constraints. The constraints, again, of the foolish path. He that sends a message by the hand of a fool cuts off the feet and drinks damage. That's quite an interesting set of images. He that sends a message by the hand of a fool cuts off the feet and drinks damage. So here again, we're focusing heavily on the fool, it would seem, in this chapter. Now the thought that comes to mind here, given the verses that we've had and then the entry into this verse, like with many verses, we are dealing with identity here. We're dealing with our own identity, but also trying to visualize the identity of other things, the fool being one obvious one, the main thing that we've been thinking about lately. But also, we're thinking about this, at least I'm considering this process of inoculation, by which, in the process of considering other identities and reflecting on our own, we are expanding our own, but also building up defenses against the possibility of someone, the foolish person, coming in, asking us a question, prompting us to follow his path, to play by his rules. And given this reflection, given the production of this imagistic landscape, illustrative landscape, we can imagine the scenarios for which this might play out. But in a general sense, I think it's useful to stop here for a moment and to consider the perspective that I've been taking. The perspective that I've been taking has assumed certain things. I've tried to add aspects of my own experience earlier on that I might work to improve such that I don't myself become the foolish person, or to continue to exercise the foolish aspects of myself. In the past couple of verses, I really haven't focused on the aspects of myself that are indeed foolish, that ought to be identified and gotten rid of, uprooted. And so for this next verse, I want to shift my perspective a little bit and to dive within myself and try to really grasp on to some of these foolish tendencies, and then to use them as fodder, to use them as a way to push them out of myself, and to almost imagine myself communicating with these aspects of myself. Now, the myself that I'm thinking about is the self that is absent these foolish characteristics. But I'm not sure if there's a better verse that we've had so far that would allow us to do this sort of thing. Because in the previous verses, we're sort of being prompted to consider that we are outside of that situation, that we're not necessarily the foolish person, we are the one that is talking to the fool. But in this verse, I suppose we can imagine the same. The language is kind of similar. He that sends a message by the hand of a fool. But instead, again, this time, we are going to explore the fool that is within me, and I will examine how it is, what it means, to pass on an image of those aspects, or pass on a message, I should say, of those aspects of myself that would fit the mold of that fool. So let's begin. Now the hand is quite a peculiar thing. Something that has such a fine degree of motion, fine motor skills, designed to manipulate objects intricately, to break things apart, to put things together. There's a lot that we are afforded through our hands. But of course, this would be nothing if we had not the mind to put into action our desires or our purposes. So in this situation, it seems relatively clear that the hand of the fool is an extension of his mind. It is the operating component in the physical sphere. But it is an interesting way of speaking, I suppose. Sending a message by the hand of a fool. That is, this physical appendage has reached into the mind of another. In this case, it's us. And we serve as sort of a vassal to this agent that has the authority to make the decisions, to execute on some desire, or to fulfill some purpose. I think we can also examine this from a different perspective, and that is placing our own desires, our own will, our own attention in a message that is to be propagated by some fool. Now, there are many people that I have come across in my life, and there are certain people that I would be more willing to pass on important information than others. Part of the reason for that is that the quality of information may be degraded if I give it to a certain type of person versus somebody else. It doesn't necessarily have to be a type of person. It could be a matter of our relationship. Somebody that I have built trust with over time will probably take better care of the information that I pass on to them. Now, it could be a type of a person, in which we can consider the fool a type of a person. And if I were to send information through the medium of the fool, much like the phone game that everyone in elementary school plays, where everybody stands in a line, somebody creates a message, and by the time that information gets to the last person down the line, it's severely distorted. I think in this situation, if information is given to the fool, it will likely be distorted. The other way around, in which we have the example of the fool's hand reaching into our spirit, occupying our will to a degree, that we are tasked with carrying foolish information. We are eroded by this experience, I think. Now, it's easy to become or to operate in a certain state of mind in which there's not much critical thinking, there's not much reason. We just do a job so that the job can be done. It doesn't matter what type of information is being carried. But at some level, we are establishing a relationship to that exchange. We are interacting with the foolish person, and we are carrying that foolish information. Now, I had mentioned that I want to explore my own experience, selfishly perhaps, but I think the two possibilities here, the two ways in which one can interpret this, comes together quite nicely within the individual experience. I had also mentioned that there are aspects of myself that I consider to be foolish. While I hope to be considered somebody that is not foolish, I do recognize that although I suppose it's possible that my entire being is just one giant fool, it's more than likely, as with many people, the case that there are elements of my behavior, of my participation with the world, that can be considered foolish, perhaps certain states of mind that I find myself in, whatever the case may be. But as I was going through the two different possibilities for which we can interpret this verse, there seemed to be this intuitive convergence. That convergence would be within myself, that I am a singular agent, but again, I possess these qualities, these components to myself. Now, if we open up this door, we enter into this plane, the plane of my mind. In some sense, it is a dedicated realm, but also a realm that is highly confusing. The attention often is weak, and that it takes quite a lot to hold it. When it is held purposefully, it generally creates good things. It certainly has potential to create good things. But there is this tendency away from that which should be, and towards things that are unproductive, towards things that really don't mean anything. And the justification for such things, the justification for my foolishness, is that I need rest. And although that there may be times in which rest is required of us, I think it's difficult to draw the line, especially in the face of fatigue. Fatigue can come at all sorts of different times and places. Sometimes I can find myself well rested and yet quite fatigued because of an overarching experience in life. Now, this will take some time, I think, for me to completely flesh out, but I think that this is going to be going somewhere. Now, I've brought this up before in the Proverbs, and I'm not a stranger to using my own experiences to make sense of what I read. As of late, I think there has been a more common theme, that there's something about myself that I would like to change. There's something that I would like to be more than I am now. And I always come back to this fatigue. And it's not necessarily that the fatigue is the only thing that is important here, but it is one of the primary things that I think that my mind, when confronted by it, tends to become shaky. And what I mean by that is the attention begins to become shaky. The things that I value, I still value, but my ability to participate in those things, for example, exercise, or partaking in a Bible study, these things become increasingly difficult, as they should, as fatigue grows. And I don't think it's a matter of the response, but it's a matter of the behavior. My feelings, I have no issues with. The difficulties of life will be there regardless of my wishes. But it is how I deal with such fatigue, and perhaps failure, that I think can use some work. And although there have been periods in my life where I have identified this sort of thing and made changes for the better, it seems that every step, there's another interesting image that comes to mind here, which I haven't seen for some time in the Proverbs, but it is a theme that is seen early on. It is the theme of the transcendent staircase. This transcendent staircase, it has its horizontal, it has its vertical. And as we are on this journey, regardless of where we are in that elevation, in that staircase towards the top of it, we wish to ascend, but at every rung there will be a challenge. We will be facing a form of a crisis for which we have to overcome it, we have to solve it, resolve it, and whatever. And there's a certain degree of comfort in that, to know that regardless of who we are, of how good we may be, or however bad or foolish we may be, that we are all going to face these dilemmas and these challenges. So going back to the verse, when I think of the either or, he that sends a message by the hand of a fool, again, to be made specific, as I've mentioned earlier about the potential in which information going out leaves me, jumps onto another vessel, that of the fool, that then transmits the information, or in a reverse situation in which there is more than one identity involved, that the fool is offloading information onto me that I am then transmitting to somebody else. Now, I think it becomes interesting when the landscape becomes singular, that we are talking about one individual, and that there is a form that emerges, a form that interacts with us. I suppose we can say that it has its own agency. Our conscious experience gives it its own agency, that of the fool. He exists within us. There are various ways in which we can come to understand what the fool is. But going back to what I said earlier about this being aspectual, that the fool is but an aspect of many of us, that the fool does not encompass the core of our identity, hopefully. But nonetheless, he is within us, he is ingrained within us, and he sits at his desk and perhaps part of the reason here, as I think about him sitting in my mind at his desk, I wonder if I don't know him well enough, because I paused for a moment and I said, well, what is he doing at his desk? Surely I should know. I've defined the fool numerous times, not only in this chapter but in many previous chapters, that the fool is somebody who cannot orient his attention well. The fool cannot give proper justifications to his actions. He may inadvertently do evil, but he perhaps doesn't necessarily intend to. He is somebody that lives on the surface, a superficial person. A fool is somebody that has graduated from adolescence to adulthood, but has retained that mind of the adolescent that has yet to see a larger picture of life, of the world. The fool is one that has a difficult time controlling his emotions. And I think this is something that I've mentioned, but it stems from the inability to accurately orient his attention. And because he is unable to do so, all of those emotions find themselves to be within this coliseum of competition, fighting amongst one another, stealing energy from the central processing core of that agent, and all the while not really doing anything all that productive. I have to wonder about that analogy. Perhaps we should bring the heart into this conversation, as well as our reason. In the Proverbs, I think we are prompted to consider two primary aspects of mind, more of the rational side of mind, and then of the emotional side of mind. Both are necessary for the human experience. Both are the human experience. And the way in which we come to truth will ultimately be filtered through this experience. Now we can try our best to control for it, to reduce things about the way in which we interpret the world that may introduce a confounding information in the process of determining what is true. But we cannot reduce ourselves out of the equation. Because if we reduce the agent that is trying to solve the problem from the problem, then the problem won't be realized. It won't be understood by the agent. So, some of this, speaking of the fool, not knowing how to orient his attention, some of this I'm going to place on the back burner, just so we have it. Almost like the coals of a fire that burn long and slow. But going back to this fool, I imagine him sitting in this environment. I'm not really sure why it's this way, but he's sitting at a brown wooden desk. The environment is lit up by a lamp and a few candles. This wooden bench is almost like a carpenter's bench. There's some beauty to this bench. Perhaps he made it, perhaps not. It's hard to say. But every once in a while, since he's at work at this place, at this brown desk, and I should mention that this work is the place that he is in is a comfortable place to him. So perhaps it's his home office. It's his workshop in his basement or his garage, who knows. But undoubtedly, just like a carpenter is related to his city or his town, and by extension his society, the fool is related to us. Again, on the individual scale, he's a part of the broader agent. And so he possesses certain responsibilities. Now we are being asked to consider a specific responsibility here, in the case of these Proverbs. We're considering a message. We are considering exchange of information. Point A to point B. And I have to imagine that within the individual now, as opposed to imagining different agents, I think that the result is probably going to be fairly similar, but since it's from within, I think it's a little bit more interesting. Since the fool is an aspect of ourselves and he is responsible for something, whatever it might be, and I suppose it's, in my experience, I should give where I think he is in that map. Now, I think it's contextual where he exists, much like our contemporary culture, in which we are subdued by psychological warfare. I think the internal domain is much plagued by the same. And I mentioned that fatigue earlier, and in my particular situation, whether it be after a long day of work, waking up on that Monday at 5 a.m., not stopping work until 7:30, and then wanting to do my Bible study. This sort of thing challenges me, and it's something that it gives the fool an opportunity to grow. That sort of psychological contagion within spreads to different aspects, to greater and greater parts of the whole. The greater that my mind expends energy and becomes, as I've said, fatigued. But going back to the central question, what is this fool responsible for? The answer that I gave was contextual. But I'd like to ask another question, that regardless of this being contextual, and perhaps I should say regardless of this being a situation in which there is more influence by the fool versus less, I still want to know what he's doing, what he's responsible for doing. The other thing that I would like to know is this fool going to be a perpetual resident of my inner being? Or is this a person that I can transform into a better component, agent of the broader agent? And again, my answer is contextual. It's based on what my goals are and what my purposes are, and what my life is like at that particular point in time. In terms of certainties, I'm not sure I can come to an answer, but I do think I can understand what the fool does at his bench, in his workshop. Let's say, for example, keeping my experience in mind, that there comes a problem down through the various interworkings of this inner society. There's a way in which this reverberation of the dilemma is dealt with by many different aspects. Some aspects are concerned about maintaining composure. Some aspects are concerned about solving the problem at hand. Some aspects are interested in solving the problems in unique and different ways. All of these things, I think, require a splitting of attention, but also there is like a sub-agent, as I mentioned. The fool would be a sub-agent, but another type of sub-agent that maintains coherence among all of the different possibilities of where the attention can go. And this agent is not a fool. This is the opposite of the fool. This is the one that strongly orients the different elements together. Now, the fool is both somebody that has been unrecognized by the subagent that orients attention, but I think he is also the person that doesn't understand the problem, and that doesn't take the time or develop the patience to think through what the problem is and how to potentially solve it. What he is concerned with primarily is being relieved of the burden that is felt by what is presented in front of him. And so if he is given, for example, since I mentioned this carpenter's analogy, a few different pieces of wood, and he is given all the tools in the world, even though he may not understand exactly what tool is for what purpose, instead of taking time to determine exactly what the best course of action or best solution is to a particular problem, he shoves a nail in without giving it much thought. And he does this over and over and over again until something approximating a solution to the problem emerges. But it ends up being a poor justification, because he really hasn't taken the time to answer the why at every step of the way. I think part of the reason that he does this is because it's, number one, it's burdensome. Number two, because of that burden, I think he feels pain, discomfort. And it's the pain and discomfort that overwhelms the circuit. The fool is a circuit that is quick to break. It needs to be reset. And I think part of the reason that he's quick to break is because he's poorly integrated into the rest of the being. But if he's poorly integrated into the rest of the being, one must wonder, what is it about the central agent that is causing him, that allows him to exist within that network, that neural network? Because the central agent understands that there must be suffering in life. There must be burdens that are accepted. The central agent may be disturbed by something. Disturbed in the sense that there's something so jarring, something so off-putting, that much like the fool, it cannot pay attention to the simple questions or what's right in front of it, although it may seem obvious. And so the question is then, well, what is it that burdens the agent so? What would give such cause to disrupt one's attention and to ruin such an experience of life? And to the best of my ability to understand it, I think it has to do with existence itself. How paralyzing it is, how many things there are to pay attention to, and how many paths that one can go down. Now this seems to be a direct line into the fool's workshop, expressing exactly what he feels. And because of the variability, he becomes scared. Scared that he may not come to understand anything because his existence is so inherently confusing. Now, of course, as the agent suppresses that type of language to a degree, he understands that it's not much about paying attention to all things, but just the things that really matter. And the agent has done well to pick things that stabilize him, stabilize his finances, stabilizes relationships. And yet, the fool persists, poking at him, telling him that his attention is not as solid as he thinks it is. And in this way, I think about the court jester who pokes fun at the king or the ruling party, and he is the only one that really gets away with this type of language. Because just as in the society this is necessary, within the collective mind, it's necessary within the individual. This also comes back to another pattern that is seen often in the Proverbs. And the exact language that I have used, I may not get completely right here, but there is this idea of the center of something always having a degree of the periphery integrated within it, almost in this paradoxical, unfortunate sense. Much like in the heart of our own cities. Let's take a good city, for example. Many of the cities in the United States are having a difficult time, but let's imagine New York City in its heyday. Undoubtedly, even though it was at the heart of a society and of a civilization, that it was meant to be this pillar of stability and of possibility, still there was sorrow, still there was suffering, still there was wanting. Now, before I get too far with that line of thinking, and actually potentially glorifying the fool within me as being something that is a positive thing, I'll say that there is no better way, I think, to cut off one's feet, or that which carries them, than not to know exactly where to place one's attention. Because the feet will move, they will run, as the mind makes its decision about what to do. And if it cannot make a decision about what to do, it will not move. There will be no difference, effectively, as if one were to leave the fool in charge versus to cut off the feet. The symbol of drinking damage, drinking poison. It is a disease, it is a parasite, that the fool can become something cancerous, and it can take over the network where the agent, the primary agent, lives in a foolish manner, is a fool. His foolishness becomes systemic. And I think the beauty about this verse is that it is asking us to contemplate not just the role of the fool, and how he may be a perpetual component of our experience, but also the way in which the fool, if let run uncontrollably, will reduce the agent into something that is akin to a being that really has no direction or movement in the intelligible sphere within the mental domain or the physical domain. So I think I'm going to end this episode here, and I'll continue next time with verse 7 of chapter 26 of the Proverbs.